When he arrived for the interview, I was surprised. I had expected someone older, more like the grandfatherly babysitters from movies. Instead, Andrew was in his late 20s, tall, with an easygoing smile that instantly put the kids at ease. He got the job partly because we were desperate, and partly because I saw how much the kids adored him. He didn't just supervise them, he played with them, made them laugh, and somehow managed to get them to eat their vegetables without a fuss. My husband Greg was often away for work, and Andrew filled a gap in our lives that I hadn't even realized was there. It started innocently enough, small conversations in the kitchen while he packed snacks for the kids, quick laughs over the antics of my youngest, Ella, who had taken to calling him Andy. I didn't notice at first how much I began to look forward to those moments when it was just the two of us. He had this way of really listening when I talked, something Greg didn't always do. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Andrew stayed a little longer to help clean up after Ella's birthday party. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that feels rare when you have 3 kids under 10. I handed him a glass of lemonade, and we sat at the kitchen table chatting about everything and nothing. "You're amazing with them," I said, gesturing toward the stairs where the kids were sleeping. "They make it easy," he replied with a shy smile. "You've raised good kids, you know." I felt a flush of warmth at the compliment, but quickly brushed it off, telling myself it was just polite conversation. But later that night, as I lay in bed with Greg snoring softly beside me, I found myself replaying the way Andrew had looked at me when he said those words. The next day, things felt different, not outwardly. Andrew was as professional as ever, and I kept things casual, focusing on my work and the kids. But there was this undercurrent I couldn't ignore, a subtle shift in the way I was suddenly hyper-aware of his presence. It wasn't just me, or at least I didn't think it was. There were moments when our eyes would meet across the room, lingering a second too long, a brush of his hand when he passed me the baby's bottle. These tiny fleeting touches shouldn't have meant anything, but they did, at least to me. One afternoon, as I was sorting laundry in the living room, Andrew came in from the backyard where he'd been playing with the kids. He stood there wiping sweat from his forehead, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. His t-shirt clung to his chest, damp from the heat, and I felt ridiculous for noticing. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice breaking through my thoughts. "No, I'm good," I said quickly, my cheeks burning as I focused on the pile of socks in front of me. But as he turned to go, I caught him glancing back just for a second. It was nothing. Or maybe it wasn't. After that glance, everything seemed to shift, not in any overt way. Andrew was still Andrew, and I was still trying to be the busy, reliable mum. But the tension was undeniable, lingering in the spaces where we crossed paths. The day after our quiet talk in the living room, the weather was unusually warm for the season. The kids begged to go to the park, and Andrew offered to take them. At first, I stayed back, planning to use the time to catch up on work. But something pulled me outside. I threw on a light jacket and followed them. When I arrived, the kids were running wild on the playground, their laughter echoing through the crisp afternoon air. Andrew was standing nearby, watching them with a small, content smile. I walked over, and he turned at the sound of my footsteps. "Decided to join us?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes lingered on mine a moment too long. "Figured I could use the fresh air," I replied, trying to sound casual as I looked out at the kids. When we ended up sitting on a bench a little away from the playground, where we could still see the children but have some space, The conversation started easily enough about the kids, the weather, random little things. But then he turned to me with that steady, thoughtful gaze of his. "You've been quiet today," he said. "I've just had a lot on my mind," I replied, brushing a loose strand of hair from my face. He nodded, leaning back against the bench. "Anything you want to talk about?" For a moment, I considered opening up, telling him about the growing weight I felt every day, balancing work, motherhood, and a marriage that felt more like a partnership of convenience than anything else. But I caught myself. He wasn't the person I should confide in, even if it felt so natural to talk to him. "I'm fine," I said instead, offering him a small smile. He didn't press, but the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like he understood, even without me saying a word. The kids eventually ran over, breathless and red-faced, begging for snacks. Andrew stood, pulling a bottle of water from his bag and handing it to Ella. "Here you go, kiddo," he said, ruffling her hair. As I watched him interact with them, I felt that familiar pang of warmth. He was so good with them, patient, kind, and attentive, in a way that made me feel both grateful and envious. When the kids wandered back to the playground, Andrew turned to me again. "You're an amazing mom, you know that." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I don't always feel like it." "Well, you are," he said firmly. "The way you handle everything, it's impressive." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I looked away, focusing on the trees swaying gently in the breeze, but I could feel his eyes on me. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, but as we walked back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted again. The tension was still there, unspoken but undeniable. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I stepped outside to sit on the porch. The air was cool now, and the faint chirping of crickets filled the quiet. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, closing my eyes and letting the stillness wash over me. I didn't hear Andrew approach until he spoke. "Mind if I join you?" I opened my eyes, startled, but nodded. He sat on the step below me, leaning back against the railing. "It's peaceful out here," he said, glancing up at the sky. "It is," I agreed, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat in silence for a while, the space between us feeling both too close and too far. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "I hope I'm not overstepping," he said, "but you seem like you could use a break from everything." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the concern in his eyes. He wasn't just saying it to be polite. He meant it. "Maybe," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. "But life doesn't really give breaks, does it?" He smiled faintly, turning his gaze back to the yard. No, I guess it doesn't." For a moment, the air between us felt charged, like a thread pulling tighter and tighter. I could feel it in the way he shifted slightly closer, his shoulder brushing against the blanket draped around me. But just as quickly, he stood, breaking the spell. "I should probably head in," he said, his voice back to its usual easy tone. I nodded, clutching the blanket tighter around me. "Good night, Andrew." "Good night," he replied, his gaze lingering on me for just a second longer before he disappeared into the house. As I sat there alone under the stars, I couldn't ignore the ache in my chest, the mix of relief and something else I wasn't ready to name. The next few days passed in a haze of avoidance and stolen glances. I tried to busy myself with chores, errands, and the kids' endless energy. But it was impossible to ignore the way Andrew's presence seemed to fill every room he entered. He was careful, respectful, and professional. But the air between us felt electric, like something was waiting to ignite. Then came the evening that changed everything. Greg had called to say he wouldn't be home until late again, and the kids were asleep upstairs. I was in the backyard tidying up after dinner when Andrew stepped out of the house. He was holding 2 mugs of tea, his silhouette framed by the soft light spilling from the kitchen. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing me one of the mugs. "Thanks," I murmured, taking it from him. My fingers brushed his, and the brief contact sent a jolt through me. He sat down on the edge of the patio and I joined him, the cool night air wrapping around us. We didn't speak at first, just sipped our tea in silence. But the quiet wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt heavy with unspoken words. After a while, he broke the silence. "You've been distant," he said, his voice low but steady. I glanced at him, my heart pounding. "I've just had a lot on my mind." "Is it me?" he asked, his eyes meeting mine. There was no accusation in his tone, only a quiet vulnerability that made it hard to look away. I hesitated, gripping the mug tighter. "It's not you, it's me. This situation." He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I get it. I really do. I don't want to make things harder for you." "You're not," I said quickly, and he looked up again, his expression searching. The words hung between us, unspoken but understood. I knew I should stand up, walk back into the house, and put an end to whatever this was, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed, and when he shifted slightly closer, I didn't move away. His knee brushed against mine, and the contact sent a wave of warmth through me. "I don't want to overstep," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the crickets. "You haven't," I whispered, even though I knew we were dangerously close to a line we couldn't uncross. He reached up, hesitating for a moment before brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. The touch was so gentle, so deliberate, that it felt like the world had stopped spinning for a heartbeat. We just looked at each other, the tension between us crackling like a live wire. I could feel his breath, warm and unsteady, and my own heart thundering in my chest. Then the sound of a car door slamming in the distance shattered the moment. We both jolted, pulling away, as if the spell had been broken. I I started, but the words wouldn't come. Andrew stood, running a hand through his hair. "I should go," he said, his voice tight. I nodded, clutching the mug in my hands as if it could steady me. "Good night, Andrew. Good night," he said, his eyes lingering on mine for one last fleeting second before he disappeared into the house. I stayed outside for a long time after he left, staring up at the stars and trying to make sense of the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Relief, regret, longing, all tangled together in a way that left me breathless. When I finally went inside, the house was quiet. Andrew had already left, and the kids were still fast asleep. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the way he had looked at me, the way he had almost but not quite closed the distance between us. It would have been so easy to let it happen. to let myself fall into something that felt as terrifying as it did inevitable. But it hadn't happened, and that was the thing about almosts. They lingered, haunted, and whispered of what could have been. The next morning, when Andrew arrived, everything was back to normal. He greeted the kids with his usual warmth, and we barely exchanged more than a few polite words. But when our eyes met briefly across the kitchen, I saw it. The quiet understanding, the shared memory of a moment that had come so close to changing everything. And then he looked away. And so did I. Because some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. Mark had recently taken a job in the city, and until he settled in, he had been bouncing between friends' places and short-term rentals. I didn't mind at all. Mark was fun, easygoing, and he blended seamlessly into our lives. But the timing turned out to be a little strange. My husband got called out of town for a work emergency right after Mark arrived, leaving just the two of us in the house. "You'll be fine," my husband had said as he packed his bag. "Mark will keep you company." The first night passed in a blur of takeout and casual conversation. Mark had always been charming in a relaxed, effortless way, and I found myself laughing more than I had in a while. We stayed up later than I'd planned, sharing stories and sipping wine in the living room. The house filled with a warm, comfortable silence whenever we paused. I told myself it was just nice to have some company. But there was something else. A kind of undercurrent in the air that felt different. I pushed the feeling aside, thinking I was just tired. But the next day it was still there, lingering in the glances we exchanged, and in the subtle way Mark's hand would brush mine when he passed me something. It was almost imperceptible, easy to ignore if I chose to. But it made my heart beat a little faster every time. I had no reason to feel this way. No reason at all. Mark was my husband's cousin, someone I'd known for years. But something about being alone together, just the two of us, brought a kind of awareness that I didn't want to admit. I told myself it was nothing, just a reaction to the quiet house, the sudden change in plans. But when Mark looked at me, there was something in his eyes that made me question everything. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of anticipation, a subtle awareness that I wasn't alone in the house. I could hear Mark in the kitchen, the clinking of cups, and the smell of coffee wafting through the hallway. I quickly got dressed and joined him, trying to brush off the nervous energy I felt. When I walked in, he looked up and gave me an easy smile, handing me a mug of coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said, his voice warm and familiar. I took the mug, feeling the warmth of his fingers lingering against mine for a moment longer than necessary. "Thanks," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We moved to the dining table, and he began telling me about his job, his new life in the city, and the frustrations of navigating it all. It felt natural, the way we fell into conversation, but beneath it all, I could feel that strange energy still there, like a current humming just beneath the surface. At one point, he leaned forward, resting his hand close to mine on the table, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. His presence seemed larger than life in the quiet of the house, each glance and every small gesture carrying an unintended weight. We'd been talking for nearly an hour, but it felt like minutes. When I got up to clear our mugs, he followed me to the sink. We stood side by side, our arms brushing as we worked, and I was painfully aware of how close we were. I could feel his eyes on me as I turned to set the dishes aside. And when I finally looked up, Our faces were closer than I'd realized. I could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the hint of a smile that played at the corner of his lips. I took a step back, breaking the spell, and forced a laugh, trying to shake off the tension. We should probably find something to do, or we'll end up drinking coffee all day, I said, hoping it would lighten the moment. He agreed, and we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, a neutral, harmless way to fill the day. Outside, the air was cool, and we fell into a comfortable rhythm as we walked. The tension between us eased a little, but it wasn't gone entirely. We talked about anything and everything, from our favorite music to the small frustrations of life, sharing things we'd never really discussed before. I felt myself relaxing, letting my guard down. And there were moments when we'd laugh or share a look that felt just a bit too meaningful. At one point, as we paused near a small park, Mark turned to me, his expression more serious than before. "You know, it's been really nice being here," he said. "I didn't expect it to feel so easy." His voice was soft, and I could feel my cheeks flush under his gaze. "I feel the same," I replied quietly, feeling a mixture of guilt and excitement that I couldn't quite shake. Standing there with the world moving around us, it felt as if we were in our own bubble, a place where consequences didn't exist. After the walk, we spent the rest of the afternoon around the house, cooking together and laughing about silly things. There was an ease between us that felt new, a kind of intimacy that didn't belong. By the time evening rolled around, I was acutely aware of how the day had changed something between us. Every shared look, every casual touch felt deliberate, like we were moving toward a line neither of us wanted to cross but couldn't seem to avoid. As we sat down for dinner, I felt the weight of everything that had gone unsaid hanging in the air. The candlelight cast a warm glow across the table, and I caught myself watching him more than I should have, noticing the way his eyes would linger on me just a second too long. I was torn between wanting to say something to break the tension and wanting to let it grow, curious to see where it might lead. When the meal was over, I cleared the dishes and found myself standing by the sink, lost in thought. Suddenly, Mark was beside me again, reaching past me to grab a glass from the shelf. The closeness was dizzying, and I felt my heart pound as he leaned in, his arm brushing against mine. "Thanks for everything today," he murmured, his voice low and close to my ear. I could feel the warmth of his breath, and for a brief moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe, caught in the magnetic pull of his presence. I turned slightly, our faces just inches apart, and for a heartbeat, it felt like everything else faded away. But before I could say anything, he straightened, giving me a small, almost knowing smile, before stepping back, leaving me standing there, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to admit. That night, I lay awake for hours, my mind replaying every small moment between us, every glance, every laugh, every brush of his hand. It lingered in my memory, making it impossible to relax. I kept trying to reason with myself, to push the feelings away, but they only grew more vivid in the quiet darkness. The next morning, I almost expected him to act differently, for something to be strained between us, but he was as calm and friendly as ever, falling into our usual banter over breakfast. It was almost enough to convince me that maybe, just maybe, I'd imagined the whole thing. We kept busy, filling the day with errands and light conversation, as if to avoid giving ourselves any time alone with our thoughts. But by the time evening rolled around, the easy distractions faded, and the tension returned, creeping into the silences between us. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the house filled with the soft glow of the lamps, I could feel the shift again. We were sitting in the living room, each of us on opposite ends of the couch, but it felt like an invisible thread was pulling us closer. Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching me with an intensity that made my heart race. I felt myself mirroring him, leaning closer without meaning to, until we were sitting only inches apart. His gaze flicked down to my hand resting on the couch, and for a moment I thought he might reach for it. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, and it felt like the room had shrunk, closing us into this small, charged space. "I don't think I've ever felt this way," he murmured, almost to himself. His voice was soft, filled with something vulnerable and raw, and the way he looked at me made it clear he wasn't talking about anything casual. I felt my throat tighten, and I struggled to find words. "Mark, we shouldn't," I whispered, even as my heart seemed to beat in time with his, caught in that same undeniable rhythm. "I know," he said, and for a moment, the spell seemed to break. He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face, as if he were trying to shake himself free. "It's just this weekend, being here. It's felt different, more real than anything else." I knew exactly what he meant because I'd felt it too. That strange, unexpected closeness that had grown between us, something I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same one tearing at me. And for a split second, I thought about closing the distance, letting the pull between us finally win. But I knew if I did, there'd be no going back. Instead, I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing myself to stand. "I think we both need some space," I said, barely able to meet his eyes before something happens that we can't take back. He didn't argue, just nodded, looking at me with an expression that held both regret and understanding. There was a heaviness in the air as I walked out of the room, and I felt his eyes on me the entire way. Once I was out of sight, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my hands shaking as I tried to process everything. That night, I stayed in my room, keeping the door closed and lying awake, feeling the weight of everything we'd almost let ourselves fall into. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the urge to jump, but knowing the fall would change everything. In the morning, Mark was already gone, leaving behind a note on the counter thanking me for the weekend and wishing me the best. The message was simple, polite, like nothing unusual had happened, but I could sense the finality in it. It was as if he'd realized, just as I had, that this was something we couldn't let go further, something we both needed to walk away from while we still could. I stood there for a long time, reading and rereading his words, feeling a mix of relief and loss that I didn't quite know what to do with. The weekend was over, and life would go back to normal, but deep down I knew that some part of me would always remember the way it had felt to almost cross that line, the tension that had woven itself into those quiet moments between us. It was something I'd carry with me, a secret memory that would fade over time but never disappear entirely. And maybe that was for the best, leaving it as an almost, something that had come close but never quite touched, a feeling just on the edge of reality.